The day World War II ended in silence. The guns stopped, not with thunder, not with celebration, they just stopped. Somewhere between the last breath of April and the first morning of May 1945, the war ended the way most terrible things end. Quietly, in rooms where ordinary people were not invited. Europe had been burning for 5 years, 10 months and 4 days. Cities had been erased. Entire populations had vanished into smoke. And then, in a moment that felt less like history and more like exhaustion, it was over. But nobody rang a bell. In a small brick building in Reims, France, just after 2 in the morning on May 7th, a German officer signed a piece of paper. His hand was steady. The room smelled of cigarettes and old wood. There were no cameras rolling, no grand speeches, just men in uniforms, their faces grey with fatigue, watching ink dry on a document that would reshape the world. Outside, the streets were empty. The night was cold. The stars, if anyone had looked up, would have seemed indifferent. The surrender would be announced later, repeated again in Berlin for the Soviets, formalized for the history books. But the real moment, the one that mattered, happened in that silence. When the pen lifted, when the last signature settled onto paper, when someone closed a folder and the war, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist, and the world kept turning. In London, people woke up the next morning and made tea. In Moscow, snow melted in the gutters. In 1,000 small villages across France and Poland and Yugoslavia, children played in the ruins of buildings they no longer remembered standing whole. The silence spread outward like a stone dropped into still water, ripples moving invisibly across an ocean of grief. The thing about endings is that they arrive without instruction manuals. Soldiers stood in fields they no longer needed to cross. Orders stopped coming. Some men cried. Others sat down in the dirt and stared at nothing. In Germany, a woman swept ash from her doorstep, the same doorstep she had swept every morning for 6 years, and realized she no longer knew what she was sweeping for. In Paris, a baker opened his shop even though there was almost no flour. Habit is stronger than history. Routine survives when everything else burns. The concentration camps were opened. The living walked out first, skeletal, silent, moving as though the air itself might break them. Then came the task of counting the dead. But numbers are insufficient vessels for atrocity. 6 million becomes a word in a textbook. It loses the weight of a single name, a single face, a single moment when someone realized they would never go home. The silence carried that weight. In the months that followed, Europe tried to remember what normal felt like. Trains began running again, though the tracks often led to places that no longer existed. Refugees moved in long columns across borders that had been redrawn while they slept. Families searched for members who would never be found, and slowly, quietly, the world began to pretend it could be whole again. But the scars ran deeper than cities. A generation had learned that civilization was a thin veneer, easily stripped away, that neighbors could become executioners, that governments could organize murder with the efficiency of a postal service. The war had revealed something about human nature that could not be unrevealed, a darkness that lived not in distant lands or ancient history, but in the ordinary hearts of ordinary people. And so the peace that followed was not a celebration, it was a haunted thing. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, shadows of people remained burned into walls, permanent echoes of a light too bright to comprehend. The atomic age had begun in the same moment the war ended, as though humanity had traded one horror for another, larger and more patient. In Berlin, the city was divided. In Korea and Vietnam and a dozen other places, new wars were already germinating in the soil of the old one. The silence was not empty. It was full of things people chose not to say. Mothers who lost sons did not speak of it at dinner tables. Soldiers who came home did not describe what they had seen. The Holocaust was acknowledged in courtrooms and documents, but in living rooms across Europe and America, it became a thing people mentioned in whispers, if at all. The human mind protects itself. It builds walls around unbearable truths. It files away nightmares in drawers that do not open easily, and life continued. Children were born who would never know a world at war. They grew up in the long shadow of that silence, shaped by the things their parents could not speak about. The post-war world built itself on this foundation of unprocessed grief. Prosperity in the West, iron curtains in the East, and everywhere the sense that something fundamental had broken and been hastily glued back together. The United Nations was formed, treaties were signed, borders were redrawn with the confident lines of men who believed they could prevent it from happening again. But the same species that had created Auschwitz now possessed weapons that could end all of human civilization in an afternoon. The war had ended, but the capacity for war had only grown more terrible. In the decades that followed, May 8, 1945 became a date on calendars. VE Day, victory in Europe. Parades were held, speeches were given. Old men wore medals and remembered friends who never grew old. But the victory felt incomplete, because the war had not really ended. It had transformed. It had become the Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation, the permanent state of tension that defined the second half of the 20th century. The silence had never really been silence at all. It was the held breath of a world waiting to see what would happen next. And in that waiting, something had changed forever. The belief that progress was inevitable had died in the camps and the bombed cities. The idea that humanity was fundamentally good had been tested and found insufficient. The war had proven that education, culture, scientific advancement, none of these things protected people from their own capacity for cruelty. And so, the peace that emerged was built on fear as much as hope. Fear of what people might do. Fear of what they had already done. Fear that the silence was only temporary, that the darkness was still there, waiting beneath the surface of ordinary days. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is reading about World War II for the first time. They are learning the numbers, the dates, the names of battles and generals. They are trying to understand how it happened, as though understanding might be a kind of vaccine against repetition. But the war did not end because people finally understood. It ended because enough people were dead, because cities were rubble, because even hatred grows exhausted. The silence that followed was not wisdom. It was not peace. It was just the pause between breaths, the moment when the world looked at what it had done and could not find words big enough to hold the horror. And maybe that is what we should remember most. Not the dates or the victories or the way it ended, but the silence, the weight of it, the way it settled over everything like snow, covering the blood but never quite making the ground clean again. The war ended in that silence, and in many ways we are still living in it.